And if everything is working correctly, we are on air. Hello, everyone watching. It's your boy Trill The Cyberspace Fay, and this is another Great Debate Community Public Access Channel live discussion. Or is it? Can we even prove that? Because, you know, we had a philosophy thing last time, and that was kind of an interesting debacle. But we're not talking philosophy today. Today we're talking about the flat Earth. So, yes, that should be an interesting one.
Yay!
So does the Bible actually say the Earth is flat? Now, from a purely scientific perspective, we have many ways of knowing our Earth's shape, but there are some who may throw that stuff out simply because the Bible says otherwise, you know, super literal interpretation, you know, that kind of thing. It's kind of the same mindset as creationists. So I have a few people here with me to discuss this kind of thing. So does anyone want to start first with their particular thoughts?
Yeah, guys, I'm over here in Australia, and it's
No, you're not.
It's early morning right now, and you guys are over in the States where it's the evening or the early afternoon. So the Earth is clearly a globe.
Well, that is the same with me. I too am in Australia, but I guess an easy way to start is the Bible verse that at least a lot of flat earthers like to cite themselves.
Doesn't surprise me.
Hang on just a moment.
Okay. Well, yeah, they do like to cite themselves.
Oh yeah, yeah. The verse in question is I think it was Isaiah 40:22. Isaiah. What?
Yeah, Isaiah 40:22 would be the big one that, like, if you would ask somebody, does the Bible teach that the Earth is round, and they're like a concordance, and they'll point to that one. So yeah, that would be the big
that's the funny thing is that both both Christians of flat earthers and round earthers, for lack of a better term, will both use that exact same verse for to support their position.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of
there's not a lot to play off of. Doesn't discuss cosmology much. Where it does bump into it, it gets it wrong. But I think
very wrong
of what the historical community would be looking at is that the biblical cosmology was basically a flat Earth where there was a literal firmament that was held up by pillars, and stars were little blinky things that were up on top of that, not giant suns. And so all attempts to retrofit modern cosmology or heliocentrism or any of those things are arbitrary because they just literally didn't think about it in the Old Testament.
Yeah, I actually agree with James about this, because if God were to tell the ancient Israelites about a round Earth, that they would be flabbergasted. They wouldn't know what he was talking about, and it would kind of overthrow their entire worldview, because they lived within this context where they all believed in this ancient Near Eastern cosmology that James is describing, where you have a flat Earth, which is actually compatible with Isaiah 40:22. You know, the circle of the Earth could easily just be a flat disk.
Yeah, it could be a pie plate or a pizza plate just as easily as a sphere. You would have known by the time Isaiah is popping along, which you have to remember, we're talking about when the texts were written down, not necessarily when the tradition had been originated. But by that time, it didn't exactly take a rocket scientist to realize that eclipses were caused because the moon was coming in between the moon and the sun, or the sun and the moon. And so that the idea that the shadow of the Earth was forming the eclipse was not an implausible thing even in a geocentric framework. That was just part of this common thing. So you would have to infer that it was at least a circular thing, but whether or not it was a globe, that you'd have to get over the idea that it was rotating. And it was not an illegitimate problem. That cosmology in those days had a difficulty conceptualizing what we would now call inertia. And we really don't get all the way down until Galileo's time that they started figuring out how to do experiments that could realize that objects can be in an inertial frame. But once you get past that hurdle, then a moving Earth or a rotating Earth suddenly becomes much easier to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the whole does the Bible teach a globe thing would usually be represented by concordis. Now, a concordis would be someone who would say that you can find modern cosmology in the Bible, which I think the Bible would be answering a separate question than that. So I wouldn't say that we would expect to find it there, because there'd be no reason for the ancient Israelites to think about that, or even to write it down. So
Yeah.
It would have been really helpful, though, if a creator of the universe wanting to dissuade problems, would have slipped stuff in there, because it was a lot of people, deGrasse Tyson and others, and I've occasionally tried, that you can write really accurate cosmology in a way that would be intelligible to the local folks. But remember, supposedly God is perfectly happy to tell you don't make graven images. There's a whole bunch of things you're not supposed to do. He can weigh in on that stuff. You could think he slipped in a little accurate science once in a while. Talk about, hey, look at all these nebula and stuff. You can see only so far in the sky, but there's parts out there way beyond what you're expecting. But what we get are things like Job and very parochial things. All the animals, all the things that are mentioned as examples in the Bible are all the kinds of things you bump into in the Middle East, or stuff that they've incorporated from their bumping into Mesopotamian mythologies during the Babylonian captivity. That accounts for almost all of it right there.
Yeah. So I mean, I think if you look, why doesn't the creator of the universe slip it in there? Well, because you would then essentially be answering a misconception that people would have. Like if anybody were to raise that question, they would be coming to the Bible with wrong expectations. So for God to slip that in there would basically be to answer a question that I don't think he would even need to answer, because he would be answering a misconception.
Well, if he was on, and he would have known that we would be worried about it in the future, and it would be really nice if you, Ross, could have some nice, accurate cosmology to show that everybody.
Yes.
To believe.
True.
I like you, Ross. He's a nice guy.
Oh, so do I. He's a sweet cake. He's one of the very few creationists that actually replies on Twitter. He's always polite. I'm always polite with him. He's always invited on contrary people. He's had Eugenie Scott on his show, and they talk evolution. He has Young Earth Creationists and that, so he pushes back. He isn't always good at the pushback, but he does give it a whack in a way that the dogmatists don't.
Why is he still a creationist if he's, I don't know, this smart of a guy?
He's older. He's older.
Creationist pretty broadly, like a creationist as in someone who believes in a creator. So Hugh Ross is young. He's not a young earther. He's older.
He's a non-evolutionist. He believes in design functionally, and that modern cosmology is part of all of God's handiwork. So he's the only difference between him functionally and a young Earth creationist is the number of zeros in the cosmology, and so they're all appealing to science. In fact, Ross made a gobsmacking admission a few years back where he, in a debate, said that if he thought that the Bible taught young Earth cosmology, he would reject regular cosmology in spite of all the evidence, because the Bible told him so. So cognitively, he's in the same boat as Ken Ham.
Yeah.
He does not believe the Bible teaches young Earth creationism, and therefore he can accept all that material. But when it comes to flushing evolution material down the drain, he's exactly the same as Dwayne Gitch.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I think you're talking about the Kent Hovind debate, right? So in that same debate, Kent Hovind actually accused him of kind of the opposite of that. Like, you say he's in the same boat as the young earthers, and Kent Hovind said there's really no difference between you and Carl Sagan. So it's interesting how like different perspectives will interpret like the centrist, I guess, in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just the thing that strikes me. I almost view it now as the creationist thing. You know, like I said in my intro, kind of like creationists, it's almost like they're kind of on the same level as flat earthers in a way, because I feel like the only way they're doing it, at least with biblical flat earthers, the only reason they seem to really be doing it is because that's how they're specifically interpreting the Bible that way. And they feel like evolution's incompatible, just like how sometimes some of them feel like the round earth is incompatible. So.
Well, there's sort of two big blocks of religious apologetics. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking Christian. You'll have the liberal perspective that will want to metaphorize the parts that bump into science that doesn't fit well, or history that conflicts. Or you'll have the inerrantist type that basically takes the tradition straight up, and flushes down the drain any science or history that doesn't fit. And that's kind of the extreme polarities you find. And you find it in Islamic culture, you find it in Hindu and all that, but we tend to notice more that dichotomy in the Christian context because that's where we live and that's who we bump into.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's that black and white, though. I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think it's more of like a spectrum that you could be somewhere on it.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. But there are the polarities. You'll find that the metaphorizers, somebody like Mortimer Adler, if you're familiar with him, he's I think he just died a couple years ago. He's a very, very prominent philosopher that started out as a pagan and then he became, I think, an Episcopalian. But he would metaphorize the Bible like mad in order to accommodate modern science, but he wouldn't cut that slack for Hindus or others. He's a literalist. And so it all depends on which axis you like to gore. It's very difficult to avoid having some weird text or history in anything that has a historical baggage, and all the religions we have currently have historical baggage. So they've got weird ideas and views of history or science that that the modern believers have to cringe over or metaphorize and step past.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, that is an interesting way of looking at it. It's just I just find it interesting which science I guess they decide to look at and which ones they decide to ignore. Like it really depends on the person. Yeah. A lot of these things just kind of come from the fact that, you know, you can say, oh, they're not being intellectually honest or whatnot. But if they view, you know, like the Bible as like the ultimate authority in that and they're interpreting it this specific way, it's like they're not going to look at the science because they don't feel like the science has as much credibility. So, I mean,
you look at young Earth creationists and how they approach data sets, which I do in my TIP project, that there's a lot of secondary source reliance, dated material, limited data set, and so forth. Well, exactly the same methodology occurs when they deal with their young Earth creationist cosmology. Now, if you look at old Earth creationists, they're as methodological naturalist as all get out when it comes to cosmology and astrophysics. But then when they deal with evolution, they start sounding exactly like young Earth creationists and relying on a dated data set. So if you look at it methodologically, that's where you can see the common elements. And if you look at wackaloons like the Geronist flat earthers, they're just extreme cases of the over-reliance on secondary sources and limited data set stuff. But methodologically, they're on a spectrum of people. And so the issue is how much of the data set is dealt with.
Exactly.
Anti-evolutionism in general is only bumping into about 10% of the data field.
Yeah.
There's a lot of options for people to pick and choose what they want to funnel into the mix or not.
And so there are also people who deny germ theory and in favor of like demonic possession instead of relying on Western medicine, for example. But there aren't many, to be sure, but there are still people who take the Bible that literally, that prayer is the best medicine for diseases.
If you had a theocracy where now you could enforce orthodoxy, who knows what baggage would be made legal again. But we tend not to think about that because we've had,
I was just gonna say, James, we're gonna check your house for heretical books.
Oh boy, I am chock-a-block, but I also make a point of reading the opposition. I think part of the problem a lot of critics of creationism have is they don't read enough creationism.
Yeah.
A good sense of what they actually think and the arguments that they use, so that when you counter them, you're doing it on their turf, not on because what Jerry Coyne may said or what Richard Dawkins may say.
Yeah, like say the difference between, you need to know the difference between Kent Hovind style and more of a presuppositional creationist like Jason Lyle.
Right.
So yeah, so something interesting about the issue of whether the Bible teaches that the Earth is a globe. Some people actually use this as an apologetic for the Bible. I think this can be problematic because you don't actually need divine inspiration to account for a good observation of nature, because you have philosophers who made good observations long before modern cosmology and modern science. So you would have people who would discovered heliocentrism or predicted it long before we did.
Right.
So it would be the same kind of thing with that. You could say, well, maybe they were influenced by a philosopher, or maybe they made a good observation or something like that. So I don't think that could function as a very good argument. Yeah, I don't know. What would you guys think if you were to discover that the Bible taught that the Earth was a globe? How would you react to that?
If you discovered it,
if it does.
Yeah. If like just hypothetically,
if it does, that actually wouldn't surprise me that much.
Why not?
Because, well, first of all, I'm not an atheist, right? I'm a misotheist. So therefore, I do believe the Bible does have validity. So with that being said, as far as the whole shape of the earth thing goes, it would just make it, that much more credible to me. I mean, shoot, I didn't have to throw out evolution back when I did call myself Christian and all that. So the Bible is showing that actually, hey, indeed there's a round earth in there. It's like, oh, it's just more proof that it is true. I'm not just going to not call it true. So, yeah, it wouldn't actually surprise me that much.
Wait, so, okay, Thaddeus, when you told me before that you were a misotheist and you defined it as someone who hates theism, so I assumed that was like atheism taken to the next level.
No, not an atheist.
Okay, so you actually hold theistic beliefs, but you hate theism.
Right.
That's really odd. I've literally never heard of that.
Right. Well,
it shows you how varied human beings are.
Sorry? Here.
Shows you how varied human beings can be.
Yeah. Okay,
There's
James,
a lot of ones on the smorgasbord plate.
Yeah, James, what do you think of my question? If you found that the Bible taught a global Earth, how would you react to that?
Yeah, it would be a feather in the cap of the Bible, because it would get stuff accurate when there would have been no particular reason to think that. It's not a unique problem with the Bible. There's really no religious doctrine anywhere that's been terribly good at anticipating science. And so the kinds of stuff that we know how weird the universe is. So not only is it big and vast and old, it's also peculiar, because you got relativity theory and quantum theory, and any of that is far stranger than talking snakes or unicorns if you think about it from a scientific point of view. But nobody in any religious tradition ever anticipated that stuff. Now you find will come along and retrofit stuff. If you read Islamic apologetics, they'll try to find references in the Quran that fit up with modern science. You find it in Christianity. You'll find it even with the Book of Mormon, and Mormons will try to do that stuff. But boy, we're seeing a wonderful view of somebody driving down a road. Right side of the road. So they're in the United States, or someone using the American style of driving. It's difficult to identify exactly where it is. If they are driving on that, we can rule out Australia.
Yeah. Well, if we would, then.
He's in France.
There we go. Yes, they drive on the opposite side of the road from the England.
Right, there we go.
Weet you're in France now, but it's now dark here, and I'm in the Netherlands.
Yeah, so that's an older. It's there. Anyway, why is someone putting that up?
I don't know. I think he just wanted to join, so he got in while he's driving.
Yeah, that's ironic for you.
Yeah, it's inadvertently illustrating an important point, is how parochial the world would have appeared to anybody a couple thousand years ago. They would have known what they could see on the horizon. They could realize that there's strange phenomena to deal with, and various cultures would kind of think about some issues, but not a hell of a lot. You needed the planets to some extent, and the stars to kind of figure out when to plant, and seasonal anticipations, and that occurred way before the formation of any of modern religions. But other than that, the Jews were not in the forefront of astronomy the way that the Babylonians were, or to some extent Chinese and India, Hindu. And of course the Greeks and the Romans got involved with it.
Hold on a minute. So the guy who is driving, can you mute yourself when you're not talking, because there is wind coming?
Yeah, there's a little bit of wind coming from here.
All right, thank you.
I think he is muted though.
I was I was just gonna say he lost me at parochial, but anyways.
Right. Yeah, but no, just to clarify, because Richard asked us whether I guess hate religion or whatnot. It's weird because I actually can get along with the Christians and that just fine. Like, I feel like it's more the fact that their theology and that is not for me in particular. And if their theology is accurate in reflecting what their God is like, their God is not for me. That's the nicest way I can put it without.
Do we have a consensus or not that the biblical cosmology was flat Earth?
That's an interesting one because you know what? I've heard it said with the Hebrew, whatever,
Yes.
like their ancient Hebrew cosmology that
The traditional Hebrew cosmology was the model basically that I'm showing right now. That was the consensus back then. Now, of course, there is everyone now agrees, except for the flat earthers. Everybody agrees that the Earth is round. Even most scholars, even biblical scholars.
That the alternate version where the Earth is a sphere and that it's still the center of the universe, that's adopting Aristotelianism, and that's long after all of the actual written Bible. That's when you're into the Christian thing, when it's now a handmaiden of the imperial church, which can kind of strong arm what everybody's going to believe, otherwise they burn you as a heretic.
Okay. Yeah, and as far as the cosmology goes, I don't think they were the only ones. Like, didn't the Egyptians have their own flat Earth kind of thing as well? Like, I know it's not the same.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm not entirely sure. But remember, it was a new thing for the Greeks to figure out that the Earth was a circle, because they speculated on a sphere. They were speculating on everything, and then operation on it. You didn't need to know the shape of the Earth to be able to do the astronomy, or rather astrology, that the Babylonians were doing. And let's not forget, over in the New World, you got Mesoamericans developing their own very sophisticated cosmological system and astronomy, although it's quite a bit later, but they're doing it all completely independently. And got the Mayans developed one of the most accurate calendars ever in service of figuring out when you're supposed to rip people's hearts out.
Guys, so the issue is that in the day that when the Bible was written, the Earth was actually flat back then, but since then it's evolved and now it's more of a sphere. So
a saddle-shaped thing during the Middle Ages, and then finally settled on spherical later on. Yeah, that's the fascinating thing, is to try to put yourself in the mindset. Well, for example, the fact that there's "let there be light" in the Bible, it's not at all obvious from that big ball of fire in the sky, because the dawn comes up before the sun does, and there's a light in the air after the sun goes down. And so the idea of refraction and all of that and movement of light through an atmosphere is not an immediately intuitive object. And so the idea that you could have a big light and a lesser light in the sky, which is what they borrowed from the Babylonians, and all of that, it was very understandable that they should have the attitudes that they did. But I expect the creator of the universe to know the actual reasons for things, and it would have been nice if there could have been some clarifications along with putting in a thing to object to slavery.
I'm not saying it was the most effective way of doing things, like, in my opinion, but even if he didn't know, like, even if he did know how the universe works, could you not also see it that he explained it that way to the people because that's how the people at the time understood it?
I think that's a bit of a cop out.
You can explain
there are implications about things. Occasionally, cosmological things come up just as press agent stuff. The Book of Job, when he says, "Were you there when described the foundations of the earth? And can you create Leviathan? Can you do all of these things?" That there would have been perfectly fine opportunities to point out some stuff that were actually accurate. But all the things you get in the Old Testament are completely consistent with a Bronze Age culture. They're the things they would know about in the animals that they were familiar with. They had no clue that there was anything outside of Eurasia. They had no idea that there were the Americas, or that there were Australia, that there were Chinese. And this was even in a context in which probably if you asked the traders, about a broader world because they had the silk coming in from China and all of that. But the people who wrote the Bible just didn't care about that stuff. And they lived in a relatively insular world. In fact, given that so much of it got plugged in because of their interaction during the Babylonian captivity, an indication of how parasitical and copy-minded a lot of the Old Testament was, that they were borrowing other people's traditions, and then buffing it and turning it into their own, like the flood tale, which was not something that was in their own local tribesman thing. This was something they picked up from the Babylonian captivity. It was the Mesopotamian flood myths.
The Epic of Gilgamesh.
See, and that's
that was just the last one. Atrahasis. There's about 2 or 3 stories, a huge number of tales that largely involve the cities and kings that show up in their king list. So they're probably reflecting real events in the same way that a lot of the stuff later on in the Bible, when you get into the Davidic part, is reflecting actual relationships with actual cultures. And of course, I'm still got a soft spot for the Black Sea flooding as a deep core legend that filtered very peripherally into the tales, but most of what you see in the biblical flood tale is just stuff that they cribbed from the Babylonian version that they got during the Babylonian captivity. It's highly traumatic.
I feel like Robert should have been around for that one. Because you mentioned a lot of things there, a lot of claims that that the Bible is basically just, I guess,
this is all
ripping off a bunch of stories.
This is all like Robert's main area. I'm just like a disciple of his, so I can't reiterate it as well as he can. So we'll have to. We should really get him in here. I invited him, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is kind of his main area, but yeah. See, as far as the whole flat Earth, does the Bible teach it or whatnot, and trying to be consistent to what we've discovered about how the Earth and cosmology that works. Like, I have a way of seeing it kind of going down, kind of like this, where it's like God made a spherical Earth. And he told the people of the time, so that they know as well, or maybe they found their own. Like people before us weren't that dumb, well, at least not very dumb. So they could have been saying like, "Hey, it's a ball," but we're all misinterpreting it or mistranslating their words. And maybe one of those scribes, if they're still alive today, they'd want to slap us in the face for it. Or B, God made a spherical Earth, and the people at the time, like I said before, thought it was flat. Well, hey, I mean, it looks pretty flat, right? So, you can't really prove them wrong without, the invention of space and the maths and all that. So either way, our methodological science, tells us that the Earth is a sphere. So if we're not going to throw all that out and try to argue for it scientifically, the Earth is flat, I really only see option A or B working. So, because otherwise you're going to have to start, showing how, hey, actually the Earth is flat. And, that goes into the more science realm.
Yeah, nope.
Actually, I don't know if we were even going to science. You would go more into conspiracies. That's where you'd have to be debating.
Yeah, I guess so, when you think about it.
Well, provided you ignore almost all of the evidence, it's possible to be a flat earther, but you got to ignore all the evidence.
Yeah, that's why I said you pretty much have to be a conspiracy theorist. And if they came in here with a flat Earth argument, we would pretty much be confronting conspiracy theories. Like, we would say something like, "Well, what about the satellite images?" And they would say conspiracy. And we'd have to deal with that. So
the day a flat earther can predict a damned eclipse, I'll be impressed. But there's no flat Earth cosmology has ever worked out where the hell the little lights up in the sky are supposed to be in such a way that they can reliably do an eclipse, because it can't work in principle.
Hey guys, do you have any idea how a flat earther would respond to my argument that me being in Australia, the time is different here than it is there? How would they respond to that?
That they would say that the sun acts like a spotlight above the flat plane of the Earth, and that's why there is light here and not you or you.
That's not a very powerful sun, then, is it?
Yeah, I know it's very weird.
Yeah, and their model, it's actually
God has to replace the AA batteries in the sun periodically. This is common knowledge in theology circles, but it is suppressed by the globalist conspiracy of penguins.
Wow, shoot. I didn't know what that deep.
But they can account for why the sun sets clearly at below the horizon. They think it's to the perspective, but that doesn't explain it either.
Yeah, like it's going further away from you. It's not necessarily going.
But when you do the calculation, you can calculate that the sun would never even come close to the horizon at any time, if their model is correct. So it's
like you'd be observing something different.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, like
anyone see the old well, not all that old, a recent series that Stephen Hawking had about people recreating kind of the history of science by their own direct experiment? Yeah, because one of them had just a fabulous episode on measuring the curvature of the Earth.
Yes.
And all you need, if you got a laser, a boat on a big lake, and you got a helicopter and a telescope, because you get farther away, miles away, you really kind of need that. You can physically calculate the curvature of the Earth with great precision, just exactly as Eratosthenes did 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know what you're saying. It's like it's one of those things where, like, honestly, I feel it's hard because see this. I feel like you have to get into the realm of science really in order to actually say this kind of thing. Because even when I think about the Bible verses that they use about it, I mean, I know Robert's not here, but it just feels like it's so vague. It's hard to tell either way if they're actually saying that the Earth is flat, or if the Earth is a sphere when it comes to these verses.
I don't know if Robert would defend that the Bible says the Earth is a sphere. I know he's a concordist, but I don't know if he would go that far. That's something I'd have to ask him about.
Because you can easily point to some of these things and say, "Oh, it's actually a metaphor."
Well, yeah, I don't know if I would even say that it was a metaphor. Like for I guess simplicity's sake, you could say it like that. But you might say something like God is just communicating in the way that they'll understand, kind of like how a parent talks to a child.
Right, and that's what I was saying before too.
Yeah, like, I don't think it's right, because if I know things better than a child, and then the child asks me how does that work, I don't say, oh, just go on your own understanding. That is right. And I will try to get him or her understand how it actually works, and maybe the child won't understand it at first, but then I can explain it further.
Yeah, an illustration that I heard from Peter Enns is that like, if your child is afraid of a monster in the closet, it might not make a lot of sense for you to tell them, look, there is no monster in the closet, because they'll still come away with that belief and they'll still be afraid. So what he says you might do is like go in the closet and pretend that you're destroying the monster, and so you're kind of
right. Okay, I actually see that's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
I don't think pretending to that there is a monster there will help.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's a different perspective, but okay, well.
And because of perspective, the Earth will appear flat inside the closet.
Oh.
If you drink like a gallon of bleach, maybe everything will appear to be flat. After
yeah, indeed, yes.
Well, shoot. I mean, it already does appear to be flat. But just because something appears that way doesn't mean it is. So
yeah, I love how that problem of scale arises. That they don't really think about how really, really big the Earth is. One of the most impressive things I learned. Look at the Earth on the scale of a billiard ball. That the Earth is smoother than the smoothest billiard ball. That a billiard ball has bigger canyon in it than anything on the Earth, even if you throw in the Marianas Trench. Pictures up in space, you can see that. But when you're far enough away, the Himalayas, all the things that we think are so bumpy down here, are functionally speaking unbelievably smooth.
Actually, that's not entirely true. It depends on what billiard ball you talk about. Like professional billiard balls, they aren't allowed to have these big crevices that makes them smoother than the Earth.
Oh, well, of course, if you're going to come in with these newfangled billiard balls rather than the old, billiard ball.
If you have these crappy billiard balls in like a pub or so somewhere, I don't know. But the professionals you can see on television playing, these billiard balls are smoother than the Earth is at that scale. I will link a video where.
Well, they're made of plastic, or rather than ivory, like the old ones were.
I will link a very good video on this.
You're a shill for the pool company.
And of course, you got the big debate between your actual pool players and then those pocket billiardists, you know, that came along more recently.
Mm-hmm. It's like an art. So how long do you think we should actually
play pocket pool?
Right. Sorry, you were
pocket pool. Yeah, that's can't do that in public. You might get in trouble. But how much longer do you think that we should actually even humor them with actually having a debate on flat Earth?
You know what?
It seems like
I honestly feel like
but they are utterly trivial. As a demographic, they're absolutely inconsequential. Geocentrics play more of an active role that bumps into policy issues than any flat earther that I've ever heard of.
I don't know, like how many geocentrists do you actually know? Because a lot of people accept the space.
Tom Willis, who wrote the 1999 Kansas anti-evolution standards, is geocentric friendly, and Ellwanger, who actually wrote the equal time legislation on creationism back in the 1980s, is definitely a geocentrist. So they've actually bumped into things. They're a tiny minority in creationism, but they're active. But I don't know of any flat earther who's ever been in like government or affected anything at all in the last 200 years. It's just that they're completely inconsequential.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know, debating flat earthers might only be for entertainment value, like to get a laugh out of them, because most people...
Or practice,
most people are just going to...
Methodologically, they're very diagnostic methodologically. They are distilled case of dumb. Because in order to believe in a flat Earth, you really do have to show how much of the data stream you can flush and how readily you will accept other people's opinions selectively. Because every flat earther has to effectively be channeling tropes and pictures and videos that they've gotten on the net. Usually, not many of them are really riffing off of 19th century flat Earth pamphlets. They have a newer breed of flat earthism, but it's all hyper addiction to secondary sources and no bothering about fact checking, not working out what their own concept is. So it's methodologically diagnostic and interesting to look at.
So I wonder if there are any flat earthers who would be presuppositionalists, kind of like a young earther presuppositionalist who would say something like...
I would.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Most flat earthers are a subset of biblical apologetics. Is not a big deal outside of that realm. I'm not sure that they're...
Oh yeah. Okay. So what I mean is like a presupposition, like it's a style of arguing. Like you say, you have to look at the evidence and interpret it within my worldview, and then it'll
right.
So it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not sure your average flat earther gets anywhere near that philosophy on you. So they may invoke it a little bit, but boy, if you look at Jeranism and all that, you know, these
at
are
least not the deep philosophy.
He's a con man. Jeranism's con man. And I don't like that. I don't like that infinite plane society guy. I fucking hate that guy that made up the Pepe shit. I dislike him very much.
James, I put the link in the side chat for you to. It's a video made by Vsauce. I think you know him.
Oh yeah. Oh, I know about that one.
Yeah, it's a long video, but I linked it such that you can straight go ahead where he compares the Earth with the billiard ball.
See, the only problem with that video is that if it's the one I'm thinking
to inflict on my brain at a later date.
Mm-hmm.
See, if it's the one I'm thinking of, like it's the one video I'm thinking of.
It's 26 minutes long, and
but the piece about the billiard ball is just a minute long. Yes.
Okay.
But if you skip to
3 million views. Holy shit! I feel lonely.
Yeah, that's one of the first things I saw when I got on YouTube was Vsauce, and there was a couple other weird channels.
Weird ones.
If you skip to
the most I've been on is like 5,000. So the idea that there's some nitwit out there with 5 million views, and Jeranism has more views than I do. So I feel
it's that one. It's how much of the Earth can you see at once? Okay, I thought it was something else.
There is more to it. If you skip to 14 minutes and 41 seconds, then you can see him comparing the Earth with a billiard ball for like a few minutes or so, and then he moves on to a new.
Making billiard balls out of artificial substances back in the 19th century, and some of it was explosive, as they discovered. So there's a whole long tradition of the development of non-explosive billiard balls, and so it wouldn't surprise me if the ones we currently use are better than that. But my memory is that it was here ones. We have our crucifix.
General showed up.
Guys, we've got my my neighbor Robert here to tell us about the biblical view of the flat Earth. So, Robert, I've been kind of bastardizing your argument.
Hey guys, how are you doing?
That's Robert's American accent. So, Robert, I've been bastardizing your arguments, so hopefully you can represent them a little better than I did.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
It's got a little bit of feminine, a little bit of trying too hard.
Robert's American accent sounds like he's constipated.
Yeah, hi guys, what's up?
Oh, I definitely am.
Okay. So yeah, what exactly is your view on it? Like, do you think that the Bible actually says the Earth is flat, or what?
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
Amen.
Like what Wayne says. Wayne Fillmore says that too.
But
Would you agree then that the globe Earth really kind of only came into the Christian context when they adopted Aristotelianism in the Middle Ages?
Well, what I can do is throw in I could support both a flat Earth and a globe Earth, but the globe Earth, the latter interpretation is kind of like a ironic nuance of one particular word, and that is, if I know, like Wayne will point out that the word in Isaiah 40:22, the disk of the earth, that can be translated as a sphere. It's true, but that's part of the nuance. Otherwise, it means a flat earth. If Isaiah wanted to say sphere, he does use the word ball, which ironically is very rare. In fact, it's so rare that it only occurs like, I think, 2 times in Isaiah. A spherical ball. So if he wanted to say the Earth is a ball,
Did the Jews
then
have spherical ball games? I just got a secondary jump. Could that have an effect on it, that they didn't, unlike say the round ball rubber bunch that the Mayans made use of? So that they wouldn't have an immediate metaphor for a spherical ball in the way somebody that was used to that in that context.
No, so they had the concept of 3-dimensional spherical shapes. They did have very primitive forms of Euclidean geometry, but what we would call non-Euclidean geometry. They sort of they had methods to get around that, to have, say, triangles on, say, like a spherical object. So we're talking, primitive Babylonian.
Technical literature on some of the history of Judaic mathematics and that, because I'd really love to have it.
Yeah, no. There's plenty on that. So
put some links up for that, because I would want to include that into tip, because that's a really interesting bit to see evolution of the concepts over time and how it was applying in that. And I must say I'm kind of in a dearth on Judaic sources.
The Hebrew word that's used for that's translated disk in Isaiah 40:22. This is where the nuance comes in, and it's an interesting argument. It's a legitimate argument, even though we know that the cosmology at the time held to a flat Earth view. But in Job, the same word is used to describe the shape of the dome, the 3-dimensional spherical atmospheric dome. Now we know the dome is not a disk, a flat disk, and yet now, depending on when Job is written, like either after Isaiah, obviously a very late date, or before Abraham. But the point is, the Hebrew word for the vault of heaven, and we know the vault of heaven is a 3-dimensional object, even though it's a half sphere. is used in Isaiah to describe the shape of the earth. Now, if you were to say the shape of the earth is a flat disk, to be consistent, you'd have to say that the dome is a flat disk as well. They did not hold to the view of a flat dome. So then, is it possible that Isaiah could be, that you could legitimately translate it as a spherical earth? At least in
Robert,
Isaiah.
I'd like to respond to that. Isn't it true, Robert, isn't it true, though, that Hebrew is a less precise language? Robert, isn't it true that Hebrew is a less precise language than English? So they have fewer words and many words have multiple meanings. So it really depends on the context.
That's a good point, but ironically, not in this case.
Okay.
This is something to do with something. It basically means it's something to do with roundness. If the disk of the earth, the disk is, in their thinking, a circular object at least, but in some sense flat, right, from their perspective. And yet you have the dome, which is also a circular object, but we know, and they knew as well, the dome to be not just a circular object, it's an actual concave object that's like a sphere. So that's, as far as, if I was to defend the so-called spherical earth argument, that's probably the best you could go to. Otherwise, it's quite legitimate that they held to a flat earth.
Okay, Robert, what about the theological problems that come up with God actually teaching within the framework of an ancient Near Eastern, like scientifically inaccurate cosmology? How do we resolve that?
I don't see a problem in him accommodating that primitive science, because that's not the intent of his message.
Right.
I mean, if he were to teach, even today, if he were to talk to Stephen Hawking would be like the primitive Sumerian in comparison to an omniscient God. So the point is, what I consider to be interaction with the human race, and that is, he allows the human race to evolve, that they learn over time with respect to the sciences and so on, but yet he instills universal theological truths about himself to then lead to certain things, like in this case, in the Bible, it leads to the Messiah, it leads to Jesus.
Yeah.
And, that to me, I think the way God works around that, like correcting that, but works around that, I think is quite interesting.
I'd like to hear James interact with that. James, you there?
There we go. Turn the microphone back on there. I didn't want you to hear my AOL go goodbye. I have kind of the longer perspective, because the human species has been around for a couple 100,000 years, and through most of that time, it doesn't seem to be doing anything even remotely relating to the biblical frame. So we get a lot of things that we develop religious concepts. We have a lot of things working out of stuff. So since I'm not trying to defend the view that the Bible is divinely inspired at all, I don't need to cherry pick which pieces of it are going to fit into whatever. I'm like William James. I don't know how belief in the divine authorship of the Bible can survive the reading of it.
Yeah, I don't know, James. You did you review my nose flood paper on that, like my lecture slides on that? Because I speak about human migration and God's interaction on that.
The Noah's flood thing, it's in the same category of people who try to figure out where Atlantis was. If you're committed to a particular version of it, then you can hunt around for stuff that you want to fit into it. But if you're not, then a lot of it is kind of hair-splitty stuff. My position is that the biblical flood story is essentially borrowed from the Babylonians during the Babylonian captivity, that almost all of which is relating to the local Sumerian flooding occurrences of the Tigris-Euphrates, which was way more severe on their culture than almost any other flooding outside of the Chinese Yangtze River. As opposed to the Nile, where flooding was a good thing, essential for the stability of the state. And that there's a little bit of the Black Sea flooding thing from the infill of the Black Sea way earlier during the Younger Dryas period that probably filtered into the legends that made it into the Babylonians that eventually filtered to the biblical context. But other than that, it essentially became a theological issue rather than a scientific one. And so I would not use the Bible as relevant to this when the culture that actually is relevant to it, the Mesopotamian ones, are the smoking gun culture. The Bible is just a secondary redactor here.
Okay. See, there's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at it. It's like a lot of people say, you know, oh, for sure it says it's flat, or for sure it says it's round, but it's actually not that. There's a reason why I'm agnostic about that particular thing.
On to notice the history, and that's why if anybody has some historical literature that's relevant, my understanding of what is available is that you didn't find people thinking that the earth was something other than flat until people pondered it in Greek times and eventually did experiments to kind of test it out, and that kind of settled it. So that worldview in the Aristotelian worldview that was carried all over the place because of Alexander the Great, that Hellenized all of the culture, that then got incorporated eventually into Christianity when it became the official imperial religion in the 4th century on.
Right, and I get that, and see, this is the thing, because you know, there's a theology person in the room, so you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but since the Bible is written at 2 different times, because we got like the Old Testament, which is more the Hebrew text and all that, and then when you get to the New Testament, that's in when you're using Aramaic or Greek or whatnot. So you actually have 2 different time periods going on as far as what people's main beliefs are, because you could say historically that with the Hebrew stuff that maybe then that is when they did believe that the earth was flat. But I think by the time the New Testament era rolled around, I think a lot of people were familiar with the concept of the round earth, because I think the Greeks did their thing by then, did they not?
Oh, yeah, it was already centuries old, and if you were a scientifically literate person, to the extent that you can use that term at all for somebody in the pre-modern science realm, that was just an accepted part of things. When you get down to Cosmos Indaploustes, and I'm trying to remember the time frame, whether he was or the 7th century or earlier, but anyway, he was one of the last holdouts to Aristotelian cosmology of defending a flat Earth, and it was essentially a dead letter then. By the time you get down to Christopher Columbus's time, by that point, it was now just a debate about how big the Earth was, and he was relying on Toscanelli's miscalculation. It's actually much smaller than the old Greek measurements were. So that's why he could trot out his little Toscanelli globe that showed there's only 3,000 miles across the ocean to China and India. And that way they could beat those damn Portuguese who were sailing all the way around Africa. And by a weird coincidence, there just happened to be a landmass in the right spot, which he then labeled Indian. Functionally, he was basing it on the kind of anti-vaxxer pseudoscience of the 15th century that turned out to be wrong, and the entire course of history of the planet was transformed because of that miscalculation.
Yeah,
Well, I will.
To Thaddeus' point, there was actually a distinction between like Hellenized Jews and more traditionalist Jews, and the more traditionalist ones were really big on preserving their tradition, and they really tried to not be influenced at all by Roman Grecan philosophy. But it did ultimately, I think, overtake a lot of them. Like even the Apostle Paul, we could probably think of as a Hellenized Jew. Like he probably went to the university in I can't remember, Thaddeus.
Oh yeah, and he had a Roman citizenship. So this is a guy who knew how to play on the turf, and of course he was attempting to repackage Christianity for the Gentile market, and did a spectacular job of it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there was this Hellenized Judaism so that they probably would have been influenced by their philosophy, like the global Earth thing. Robert, I think you wanted to say something.
Well, I don't know if you know, James, but in 2013, in the Astrophysical Journal, there's a paper titled "Did the Ancient Egyptians Record the Period of the Eclipse Binary Algol?" And so they were quite astonishingly, we're talking in the 13th century BC. They gave a period of 2.85 days, with the modern value of 2.867 days. By the Finnish astronomers, and so that's quite remarkable for a 13th century BC period estimation. So it's just testament to the fact that these ancient people were fully they were all astronomers, more so than biologists, and chemists, and so on.
Well, that's where they thought the gods lived. All those little funny light bulbs in the sky.
I've heard that said before, like it was on a podcast or something. Flat Earth one, where they see with like the stars or whatnot, where they thought like stars, stars might be angels or something. It's weird.
No. They didn't think the objects. That ironically, that's a much. Let me just increase my volume. That's a much later understanding. In fact, it's so late. It's pretty much in Paul's day.
Yeah, I was saying that was a modern flat earther.
In Paul's day, if you read Galatians 4, chastises them, saying that hey, these objects in the sky, they're not gods, which is unique for someone like Paul to say that in the first century. He considered them just to be natural objects in the sky. But everyone, Roman, Greek, Hellenized Jew, they all thought that because of the retrograde motion of these things and the twinkling of the stars, they thought that these were like animated beings. But ironically, whether you consider Genesis 1 to be a Babylonian edited work or older, the fact is the specific Hebrew usages of the sun, moon, and stars, especially in verse 14. For example, Shemesh for sun is the Shemesh deity, and Genesis 1 doesn't give allegiance to the deity. It just says a bright light, a big light. So even back, just from that alone, it shows that whoever was editing Genesis did not think about these objects as gods, which is unique amongst everything else.
Well, again, we're not sure about the detailed timings of a lot of that. By the time the Bible is being written down, you have an awful lot of centuries and centuries and centuries of cultures where they have started to pay more attention to the astronomy. So piecing together all the context of that stuff is a tricky historical game. What was the link on that?
Really. You can look at the ancient Near Eastern scholarship, and they're quite thorough in this work. Thankfully, because of the Ugaritic material and the Rosh Shamra parallel texts, and pick any one of that stuff, and it's quite remarkable, really. Just again, the reason why I brought up the Noah's flood lecture thing I gave is because you mentioned we're talking 100,000 years of human existence, roughly. And I agree with that. But I was making a point that the Genesis 1 and 2 narrative actually pinpoint the migration patterns of humans from Africa into the Middle East. And so from that standpoint alone, that unique standpoint alone,
where is that again?
Thinking process.
What verse would that be again?
So Genesis 2, when it describes the geography of the garden with the 4 rivers.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so there's no rain, there's no man, there's no vegetation, but there's an underground aquifer. These are geographical clues as to the Arabian Peninsula at the time, and the 4 rivers mentioned, which the river the river from the Hijaz Mountains that go sort of northeast toward Iraq.
Yeah, and
which dried out in the third millennium BC. That is one of the 4 rivers mentioned, which we can now image via satellites.
And which time are we talking about here?
I'm suggesting, again, I'm suggesting that humans entered into that region around 70,000 years ago. The region was flooded around 14,000 years ago.
Okay. And that, of course, is a mere 130,000 years after the origination of humans in Africa.
Yes. So I'm saying Genesis 1 is very generic, a huge population of humans, obviously evolved, that originated in South Africa. And specifically the East African model.
The Neanderthals and the Homo erectus got kind of left off the whole list completely.
They would fit the category of a hominid type of species that would match the Adam mentioned in Genesis 1.
Yeah, if you decide to retrofit, nobody, as far as I know, prior to the modern science, really ever did that kind of an interpretation, did they?
Yes, they did. they did hold to pre-Adamic perspectives of Genesis 1 and 2. It's quite an ancient understanding.
And who was doing that and when?
You can trace it all the way back to the 1st century. You have Josephus himself alluding to it, and many rabbinic material, including Second Temple material. In fact, Augustine, this is Augustine, mind you, he went as far as to say that that women, he wouldn't be surprised if there were 2 men. So Adam had like a male friend, while he had his helper, which would be the woman, in the garden. So that at least gives you a hint as to what he was thinking, as far as he didn't think it was 2 couples. I mean, two people, 1 couple.
Something else that we can think about is that as we've learned the modern science, our knowledge of ancient culture is also increased. So they're kind of concurrent there. But the thing is, our knowledge of ancient culture influences the way we interpret the Bible. You know, it's a historical grammatical method. So the ancient culture kind of gives us some insight into what we're reading. So I don't know if we could say that we're retrofitting it. I think we're just learning more about ancient culture as we're learning more about science. And that information about ancient culture could change our interpretations in a way that many people in church history wouldn't have anticipated.
Yeah, see, and a lot of this is more of a culture thing. You kind of learn about the history of the times by what they believed about, like, the Earth's shape and all that. See, when you really break it down, see, a lot of people get hung up on the whole scientific arguments about the flat Earth and stuff. I mean, well, that's kind of a no-brainer there. But
yeah,
if you're
the scientific stuff is kind of boring, like how you get the animals on the ark and that kind of thing. I think they're good arguments, but they've just been repeated so many times that they're just not interesting anymore, to me anyway.
I think there's a good reason to have them, but
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, depending on who you're talking to, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a good reason to have them, but
yeah. So
I don't believe in. I believe in Jesus.
Who started this topic?
Me.
Oh, okay. Well, look, for example, like this, there's a flat Earth cosmology mentioned in the New Testament. Look to.
Oh, what?
Yeah, it's evident. Like look to Philippians 2. Oh. You have Paul quoting an ancient Christian hymn. He doesn't seem to have a problem with it by saying that that everyone in heaven and on earth and under the earth will bow the knee. That is a 3-tiered ancient Near Eastern cosmology.
So it's not just the Old Testament.
Did Paul support a flat Earth? He doesn't say that. He's just repeating what's commonly believed at the time. But he does say a few things that do what then caused commentary by early Christians, like the early church fathers. So, for example, when Paul said, "The planets are not gods," and curiously, many of the church fathers would call the objects in the sky the spheres. They would actually use that word to emphasize the roundness. And then when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that each star differs from one another, which again, when you look at the church fathers' material, they conjectured if what, like, because they still believed in the primitive idea of the four elements: earth, fire, water, wind, that sort of thing.
Interesting that you think that's primitive.
They said that because
God, there are no other gods. The planets can't possibly be gods just on that basis.
No, 1 second. So because Paul says each star differs from one another, you have church fathers saying, "Oh, does this mean that one, like, night sky object is like a watery, and the other one is a fire, then the other one is purely gaseous and wind?" You know, they take that primitive four-element idea and then apply it to the fact that Paul says each one differs from one another. And ironically, that kind of does fit our perspective, because we know there's rocky planets, there's gaseous giants, there's suns. You know, there's all sorts of stuff out there.
Well, if we're going to have that interpretation, it would be nice if the authors, if, say, God had come down and given a little inspiration, a little more clarity on the atom thing that the Greeks were already working out. So this is simply retrofitting.
No. The point is what I mentioned earlier. The point is, if God did that, he would completely alienate that audience. Even one...
Well, he's God. He tells people you're not supposed to have graven images. He tells people it's okay to own people. I mean, alienating people based on what he wants to be true seems to be God's forte.
Okay, so the graven images thing, that's actually a theological position that's pretty central to the message. But the cosmology, it's irrelevant to the message. So God is trying to convey a theological point. He's willing to accommodate this ancient cosmology to do that, because he's not very concerned about, like, he's not teaching cosmology. He's teaching
basically.
See, I actually get both people's points here, because I mean, you do have a point. I say that's not the point, but at the same time, with James, it's like, yeah, it would have been nice. I mean, it does make it seem more credible to people that are more scientifically minded.
Basically, you can see it like this. The text is fine-tuned to communicate to an ancient audience as well as a modern audience. That's it.
No, yeah, that's interesting.
There's an upper limit and a lower limit as to how much information you can without alienating that audience, and a lower limit as to not making it too wrong for a modern audience.
Right.
So to speak.
Okay. Yeah. And as far as the whole,
and I'll just quickly say this: based on the presupposition that God exists and He inspired this text.
Right. So, I mean, but do you see what he's saying as far as the whole? Like, you know, it doesn't seem like the Bible is very scientifically literate, though. Like, you see how it would have been nice?
Well, actually, Robert takes a concordist position. So Robert does think that you can find modern science in the Bible. So, Robert, maybe you can... I think that would be relevant if you went into that a little.
Yeah.
No, but that's my point, what I just said. There's
the high and the low. Yeah.
Of flexibility of, like, in his omniscience, he knows, okay, this is to not alienate these people here, and I'm thinking about these people over here in the future, and so it's this really fine-tuned type of, you know, if he did indeed inspire these people to write this stuff.
Ah, okay.
A good example of that might be Genesis 1:20, where it talks about God
Yeah.
says,
Ever since I
says,
showed Richard that one, he's been like, he's even written a blog article on it.
Oh man.
let the waters bring forth the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air.
In fact, Thaddeus, what I did 2 nights ago was just out of interest's sake, because I had nothing to do, obviously. I decided to, in my software, search every instance of Genesis 1:20 in every work that I have on my computer, and thousands of hits. But the few that I checked were by famous. Well, basically, I wanted to see the oldest works, commentaries on it, and obviously the first one would be Basil, which I've always used, in the 4th century, where he argues that the fish and the birds are related via some form of family link, and they both derive from the waters. Now, curiously, John Calvin admits that the text is saying this, and apparently people, so skeptics in his day, atheists in his day, were criticizing that particular verse because they were just laughing at the nonsense about it, like, oh, what, birds coming from the oceans? That makes no sense. And so they would scorn it. And Calvin would write, well, I don't have an explanation for this, so... And ironically, when Darwin comes on the scene, and now through evolution, we know birds, technically, through cladistics, they're part of the family line of species that do come out of the waters from the Cambrian explosion. It's technically vindicated, and it's kind of like, well, if John Calvin was living today, he would actually not have a problem. He'd be like, yeah, there you go. So but that's what I'm getting at. It's curious that messages are embarrassed by it, but they wouldn't really show their embarrassment. They're kind of going, yeah, I can see that this is, I can't explain this.
So do you sort of have my, I'm just saying, do you sort of have my position with the whole, does the earth, the Bible actually say the earth is flat, as far as, do you think it says it, but somehow that doesn't mean that, it actually is saying that it is?
I think Genesis 1 needs to, so I think the most important passage in regards to the natural order of things and especially the chronology of things is Genesis 1. You won't find any other passage in the Bible that matches that description. And I find it curious that it just highlights in a very simple format the chronology of how things came to be, which from a concordance point of view, I could go exactly what happens in the natural realm, what we understand. But when you do find other passages that then start speaking in ancient Near Eastern cosmological terms, like in this case, a flat Earth, and those passages are outside the creation narrative, I have no problem with that because it's being consistent with the ancient Near Eastern context. And so I find it interesting that there's an intentional avoidance of mentioning any geometrical shape of things in the creation account. On that issue, all it wants to do is describe chronologically the events, and what follows after that is basically men writing the Bible in the context of their day, and obviously they held to a flat Earth and so on. But then that's my last point would be what?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, keep going.
No, my last point would be that curious interpretive nuance of that Hebrew word that is used to mean a flat Earth, the flat disc-shaped Earth, and yet it's used elsewhere to describe the shape of the dome. So for me, that's a gray area. It's kind of like might as well flip a coin. Which way do you interpret it? Can we interpret it as a flat disk? Yes. A spherical dome? Yes. Which one do we go for? Obviously, we can't say it's a flat dome in that other passage, but in the Isaiah passage, do we say spherical Earth now because it can be translated spherically? Maybe. Who knows? It's kind of ambiguous at that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Robert, I meant to ask you what software you use because I wanted to download that.
Logos Bible software.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Okay. So yeah, that's more actually kind of along the same lines. Like I can see that. It's just that, I feel like there's really no way to really be too sure about something like that. Because I can see it being, again, written either way. Written for people at the time, so people at the time can understand, and that's how they themselves interpreted things, or even that's how God gave the information to them. And I can also see it the other way as well, where it actually does say that, the Earth is a globe in its own way, but it's just that people are misinterpreting it. So.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah. So either way, I mean, it's one of those things where, last thing I wanted to touch on, because I know we're kind of running out of steam here, is kind of the conspiracy kind of aspect of it. Because again, this doesn't really seem like more of a logical stance, but it feels like a lot of people kind of get, Christians, that biblical flat earth Christians, get caught up into like the whole flat earth like conspiracy phenomena, like there's some sort of nefarious government plot.
I think the echo's coming from Justin.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Justin, you're echoing.
Then you can actually mute him if you click on the.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm doing.
Okay.
Right. But yeah, as far as the whole conspiracy aspect thing goes, I just feel like, again, it's just people. I just feel like it's kind of sad because you kind of, I guess, living your life in fear, and I can kind of relate because there's a point in my life where, I kind of let this conspiracy stuff kind of get a hold of me, and without really fact checking and seeing if it's true or whatnot, or not having too good of a reason to believe it. And I think so many people just kind of get caught up in the whole sensationalism of it all, and like, don't you feel like it's very cult-like, the flat Earth stuff? I don't know. Like,
yeah, but if you have a well-grounded knowledge in what I've just described, especially, so for example, people like John Walton, Michael Heiser, those guys that have their heads in the stuff, big time, Eastern stuff. So when they come across flat earthers, they just get a little bit like, they just go, "Are you serious?" It's like a facepalm moment. It doesn't faze them, basically. They're just like, "Are you an idiot?"
Yeah,
because if the point is, if these guys were to be consistent with this, this conspiracy and so on,
right?
There's a lot of other stuff in the Bible that is obviously scientifically wrong that you have to accept. So, for example, if you believe, if you're a flat Earth Christian, right, and because the Bible says the Earth's flat, so therefore,
right,
the Earth is flat.
Right.
Guess what? The Bible says that a woman's hair is part of a genitalia, so her head hair, drawing up the semen of a man, congeal it into a fetus. That's literally what Paul is saying. So, do you believe that women's hair function in the sexual role of producing children? Do you believe, for example, like the whole homosexual thing in Leviticus, that the fact that there's no mention of lesbians is because only men produce seeds and not women, because women act as a vessel? And so the point in Leviticus is, if two men spill a seed in a homosexual act, that's why it's an abomination, because they're killing the seed, and hence there's no need to mention women in that context because they don't produce seeds. Like obviously in the science we know women produce eggs,
Right.
but again, it's these ideas that if you're going to be consistent, you also have to hold to these primitive ancient Near Eastern ideas.
Yeah,
And
otherwise you're just being consistent with one.
Means it just being inconsistent.
Yeah, and I get it. Patron, was there anything that you wanted to add? Because I was actually thinking of, Christian Anarchist. He's here too. So yeah, Patron, since you got here first, anything you wanted to add? Because you asked for the link specifically. So all he says 1 sec. Okay, Christian Anarchist, anything you wanted to say, man? Because you already know the topic.
I heard something about flat Earth.
Yeah, it's does the Bible actually say the Earth is flat? I just want to know what your opinion was on that.
Well, there's certainly flat Earth language that's in it. However, it doesn't make it a teaching. There's a difference between simply just showing the ideas and the thoughts of what people were thinking, and just describing how they viewed the world and such. And then there's a difference between things that are more prescriptive, things that are more of a command. There's a difference between things such as the 10 Commandments that are commands addressed to a specific group of people. And then you have things that are describing stories and events, such as you have the story of David and Bathsheba and all these others. Doesn't mean, go do what David's doing to Bathsheba and all that stuff. It's not trying to indicate that by any means. It's just simply showing what's going on and what happened during David's life. So there are things where not everything is a command or teaching.
Right.
In the
I've
Bible.
actually used that herd as like a weak argument against, like, I guess the Bible teachings that before when people bring up stuff that, are obviously not supposed to be teachings, you're just kind of documenting things.
Right. There's some parts. There's some parts where they're documented, just like simply describing how they viewed things, such as they viewed when the sun sets, they just looked, saw the sun goes down, so they assume the sun just rotates around them as a result of that, because there was no Galileo, there was no scientists at that time, and there's nowhere in the Bible that indicates any other form of a heliocentric view.
And a round Earth thing didn't really come into play until at least New Testament time, because that's when you had the Greeks do their
an idea can sort of play out with that, but in my opinion, I still see the flat Earth language in the New Testament as well, especially when we see like the four corners of the Earth. That's not just, but that's because some people say, and I used to say the same thing, that's referring to like north, south, east, west, referring to like the directions and such. But if you look at the model in which they believed in like a squared flat surface, and we're inside of the dome of the flat Earth, basically.
Right. So that's not even too consistent with like the modern flat Earth model, because a lot of them are on a disk.
That's why you see like then Bible believing flat earthers versus the secular or just conspiracy nut job flat earthers will be like debating over what shape is the flat Earth. Is it a square? Is it a square or a circle?
Or if it can be both at the same time somehow, right? Because it might have corners on the outside, but maybe they're not accessible. It's like, but with that, don't you not think that could also be like a metaphor, like how when people, like maybe it's like a saying or a phrase, it doesn't actually describing something literal.
And that can be something too, but at the same time, when I've examined based upon the consensus of the history and the scholarship that we have based on this issue from studies on the Middle East cultures, not everyone was believing in a concept of a globe. People had flat Earth cosmology in mind in the Middle Eastern, ancient Near East views. Israel wasn't the first type of group that believed this view. Their neighbors held to it. It was just a common view that they held of the Earth. Just like we have our different understanding of certain things, but maybe somewhere over in a pagan third world or something like that. Who knows, maybe in some aspects of politics or religious wise, they have a different understanding of how a god or how politics or how these other things work out.
Yeah.
So it's about a perspective that they had, and God wasn't coming to correct the Israelites' understanding of cosmology, just theology.
Right. Is Patron back yet? Because maybe then he can say his bit. Because if not, I was going to let everybody kind of do their closing words because I think we're kind of running out of steam here. Despite the fact we have quite a bit of people watching, there's not a whole lot of people in the Hangout.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I don't know if patrons.
Well, Tad. So are you? Because again, just you said that you're having like an anxiety about this. Is that the reason why you brought this up?
No, it's not so much an anxiety about it. It's more. No, I brought it up because I'm kind of sitting on the fence about it mainly. I mean, okay, well, mainly I brought this up because views, entertainment, that kind of thing. Because
sitting on the fence of what? Sitting
on the fence of whether the Bible actually says the Earth is round or flat. Because I'm not one of those people who's going to say, "Oh yeah, back in the day, it's those that's how stupid they were. They thought the Earth was flat." It's like, well, maybe God actually revealed it to them that the Earth was round, and we're just reading it wrong or something. So, yeah.
So, closing statements.
Yeah, closing statements. I'll let Richard go first.
All right. Thanks, Thaddeus, for having us on the Great Debate Community. I think that the Old Testament does teach that the Earth was a flat disk, but that shouldn't cause any theological distress for us because the Bible is not intending to communicate cosmology. It's trying to teach theology. So the view that's being communicated is that we should worship Yahweh alone. And so they're kind of a polemic against these other gods, especially Genesis 1. So the fact that it's told within the context of ancient Near Eastern cosmology shouldn't be concerning because it's irrelevant to the message that it's trying to communicate. And yet there are other hints of modern cosmology, as Robert might emphasize. But overall, I think the Bible does... the Old Testament especially does teach that view, but it shouldn't be concerning to us because that's not the message being emphasized.
Right. Okay. So, General, any closing thoughts for you?
Just be biases. Okay, especially with James that came in earlier. I mean, I think the ultimate issue is biases all over the place. So there can be biases from the flat earthers. There can be biases from non-Christian critics. There could also be biases from, say, someone like a young Earth creationist, or even an old Earth creationist that wants to say that certain passages, like that Isaiah passage, speaks of a spherical Earth or something like that. So biases to defend their so-called positions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've, being trained in the sciences, it's not that I don't have biases, but I can boast and say that my training constantly reminds me of the fact that I need to have no filters, no matter what the data says. So try and be honest with the data. So if the data says this is it, then that's it. We know scientifically the data shows that the Earth is a sphere. We know biblically and also in ancient Near Eastern context. And then around that context, speaking as a Christian, is there a genuine, masterful way in which God interacts both to an ancient audience and for the sole purpose of this message then communicating to a future audience? And I think, based on the data, it's quite evident that that's the case. So,
right.
There you go.
Christian Atticus, your final thoughts?
I really like your voice. That's my final thoughts. I pretty much agree with what Richard and General said.
Right. Patron, is your mic working? Because you can probably put in one more thing here.
He said he's having problems with his mic again, but he says he mostly agrees with us.
Oh man! So when this hangout started, it was like full of atheists. Then Robert and I cleared out.
Well, that's the thing. We always tend to scare him away, I guess.
Well, at least full of people that believe in theology. I don't know. Well, Justin's still in here, I think, but maybe he's away from computer. Does he have any final thoughts?
I don't think he said a word throughout the entire hangout. So
he was here. He was in the beginning. He talked, and then he just I don't know what's going on, but yeah. Either way, though, yeah, I want to thank everybody for like coming on the panel, because there is a few final thoughts that I wanted to say, particularly because I do have a little bit of experience with the conspiracy theory stuff. I find it kind of entertaining. Like, to conclude, like, whether scientifically the Earth is a sphere, a disc, a triangle, a cube, it's pretty much irrelevant to most people's everyday lives. You know, you still got that crappy job you got to go to, that one friend you owe money or owes you. Except now you maybe have to worry about the added complications that the government is lying about the shape of the Earth, along with space programs, if you're one of those flat earthers instead of just one that believes in, well, that there is no conspiracy. Yeah, like with something that being said, living in constant fear like that, I believe it's not very psychologically healthy. I myself used to think that way with conspiracies. There's actually still a little bit of that left over in me. Not that particular one, but like, it ain't good. Like, I wish I could encourage people to get out of it, you know, enjoy life. But hey, I'm just one guy on the internet. I ain't your parent. You're grown up now, so you can choose to do whatever you want. So you can choose your free will or illusion of free will to subscribe to this Great Debate community channel, so that you can keep up with the discussions like this. By the way, this is a public access channel, so all you have to do is really ask Steve McRae for permission to use this for your own Hangouts. I don't have to be the only one running things from here, but a lot of people don't seem to be using it, so and I've been doing it. You can join us in the community at the Great Debate Community Google Plus community place, where we discuss science, philosophy, theology, no politics. Sorry about that. You may want to check out Steve McRae's channel, the owner of the Great Debate Community, and he tends to focus on science. And on MX Pin Valentine's channel, that's where me and him eventually, we hope to continue our podcast where we talk about politics, news, entertainment, movies, games, and drama in this community. So sometimes we just banter. But anyways, you may want to subscribe to that. Up to you. Again, I'm not your parent. Thanks for watching.
Give a shout out to mine too.
Shout out to Christian Anarchist, because he has his Ask Christian Anarchist coming up tonight. In my time, okay. Yeah, on its Pacific Standard Time, that would be about 6. His time, it's 8. So yeah, either way, you might want to check that out. You can ask him questions. I think that's specifically theology. Either way.
Anything.
Okay, cool.
Guys, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, D's Nuts for 2069. Funded us a lot, and we really
what?
Thanks a lot, D.
Oh man,
These nuts for the next presidential candidate.
Right. Oh, and yeah, one more, because these guys are here. Shout out to Sentinel Apologetics. That's something that General and Hunter, I believe, are starting. Do you want to do a brief description of what that is, General?
Basically the stuff that I've been talking about just then, that type of stuff. That's really it.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Thanks
more. And more.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks for watching, and peace out, y'all.